I'm Dr. Soumyadip Chattopadhyay, an associate professor at Visva-Bharati and senior fellow at the Impact and Policy Research Institute, New Delhi. On behalf of the team of the Center for Habitat, Urban and Regional Studies, I welcome you all to this city conversation series. India is urbanizing rapidly, and Indian cities contribute to about 63% of India's GDP. A large section of this population includes migrants, and migration is a livelihood strategy adopted by millions of people, especially the poor in India. And while the cities do provide them employment opportunities, a substantial proportion of them are engaged in informal activities characterized by low earnings, insecure jobs, precarious working condition, absence of social protection, and dependence on day-to-day earning for sustenance. The poor condition of work experienced by the migrants are aggravated by the poor living conditions in the urban areas. And India has multiple protective legislations and welfare programs, some in place since independence, but labor migrants' lives are hyper precarious because they are being excluded from both labor laws and citizenship rights. They are often outside the purview of urban planning and policies. For example, their settlements remain largely illegitimate. Moreover, the labor migrants are subjected to social hostility. And the COVID-19 pandemic has devastated the normal life and led to a massive humanitarian crisis. Effects of the lockdown have been particularly severe on India's migrant workers, the domestic maids, construction workers, rickshaw pullers, street vendors, rag pickers, and various other kinds of informal service providers. And given the predominance of informal production and labor relations in the Indian cities, a cessation of all economic activity is bound to have severe impacts on their employment and earnings. And there are some comprehensive survey reports that show the economic hardship and the humiliations the migrants are facing. IMPRI also conducted a telephonic survey in May this year, covering roughly about 3,200 city makers across the 50 cities in India. We also found that 6 out of 10 workers had lost their job during the lockdown, and quite a significant proportion of them wanted to return to the place of work after the lockdown. And it exposed the lack of employment opportunities in their native places. Their choice was indeed between the devil and the deep sea, between starvation and pandemic. And unfortunately, the governments in India have no systematic understanding of their existing and had not anticipated the scale of the migrant exodus. This COVID-19 and lockdown has exposed the glaring gaps in Indian cities policy rhetoric, which has systematically excluded the migrant workers to facilitate economic growth. And this crisis is a window of opportunity to rethink some of the crucial questions like what explains the sudden visibility of the migrant workers in the time of public health crisis, and how do urban planning and urban governance policies and schemes respond to the migrants to the cities? What implications do these policies and schemes have on the lives of the migrants? What are the possible ways to improve their potential standard of living in the city? In fact, the Center for Habitat, Urban and Regional Studies at IMPRI, along with IndraStra Global and Citymaker Mission International, has launched a discussion series, the State of Cities, #City Conversation. And in this talk series, we have been engaging with experts on urban and regional studies to understand the challenges that the Indian cities face and the ways to overcome such challenges. And now we are today delighted and honored to have with us Professor Priya Deshingkar. Professor Deshingkar needs no introduction. She's a professor of migration and development at the University of Sussex. She's an internationally recognized authority on South-South migration research and policy analysis. Professor Deshingkar has played a key role in influencing the global policy discourse on internal migration and development. She has over 20 years of research and consultancy experience in South Asia and Africa with International National Research Institute, donors, NGOs, covering policy research with a particular focus on rural-urban migration and social protection policy in urban areas. And recent work of her has focused on the links between migration and climate change by examining the role of remittances in improving resilience and the links between adaptive social protection and migration. And Professor Deshingkar's recent major research programs include the DFID-funded Migrating Out of Poverty Research Consortium. And as research director of MOVE, she has played a key role in designing and overseeing the mixed methods research in 5 global regions, South and Southeast Asia, as well as East, West, and Southern Africa, where she has worked closely with Asia Research Institute, Singapore, the Center for Migration Studies in Ghana, and the African Center for Migration and Society in South Africa. She has also developed a strand of work within the consortium on the migration industry, which has resulted in path-breaking research on brokerage in the migration of domestic workers in Ghana and brokerage in the migration of low-skilled construction workers from Bangladesh to Qatar. And Professor Deshingkar's most recent book is on circular migration and multi-locational livelihood strategies in India, which is the key reference text for scholars working on international migration. And most importantly, she is currently advising the Indian Ministry of Urban Affairs on migration-related issues in the wake of COVID-19. So once again, I welcome you all. I welcome you, ma'am, to this City Conversation series. And also we have a very distinguished panel of discussion. Professor Arup Mitra, Professor Abi Bhagat, and Dr. Nabila Ahmed will also join us. So Professor Deshingkar today will speak on invisible migrants and hidden occupations in the city, lessons for research and policy. So over to you, ma'am.
Thank you for that extremely comprehensive introduction, Dr. Chattopadhyay. And you raised correctly a lot of the key issues already that I want to talk about today. So I will be talking about invisible migrants and hidden occupations, why that's been such a major issue during the COVID crisis and what lessons that huge debacle can offer us now going forward. So I would straight away, without further ado, like to share my slides. I'd also like to say a warm thank you to Dr. Kumar for inviting me in the first place. And it's a real pleasure to be here because I see lots of familiar names and faces here. So thank you again. So let me share my screen. I hope it works. There we go.
Yes.
Is it okay?
Yes, it's okay.
Okay, so let's just start straight away. I wanted to put this image of very flashy skyscrapers here because this is the kind of city that many countries aspire to. But, of course, all these cities are built by migrants whose efforts are very little recognized, and they remain on the margins of the very cities that they build, which is the greatest injustice you can think of, really. So first, let me start with a quick roadmap of my presentation so that you get an idea of what I'm going to talk about. And I will aim to speak for roughly half an hour so that you have enough time for comments from the discussants and question and answers from anyone else who's present. So my focus is on migrants who work in low-paid, precarious, or hyper-precarious conditions, the so-called dirty and dangerous jobs at destination. And these people are often circular migrants. I mean, I won't go into definitional issues here because, you could then start debating whether they are truly circular migrants or not, because many of them are in the city for prolonged periods of time. But, their family is often still back in the village and they may be investing for a future there or at least maintaining very active links. So I want to start by looking at the historical causes of exclusion and othering of certain groups of people and how that links to migration. And then how these differences, how the kind of hierarchies in village society are in a way reproduced in urban areas and in work relations in the city. And industries to exploit certain groups of people. Then I'll move on to the blindness of policy and industry to these differences. Also blindness related to data on migration and the poor performance of welfare measures for migrant workers. I'll talk how this all connects to the fiasco during the lockdown of so many people being left without support. And then go on to discuss the need for better analysis of the structural causes of migrant exclusion, and finally, new directions for policy, because that's the focus here today. So let's start with what happens in villages where migrants originate from. And This may sound like an obvious thing to say, but there is some discussion around this, and there's not actually a lot of agreement on why migration happens in the first place. Is it distress? Are migrants pushed out? Are they going for other reasons? I mean, of course, there is no one single answer, and everything is complicated and interconnected. So there are historical patterns of material and social exclusion within many agrarian rural societies. And the people who tend to migrate the most are those who may be, small and marginal farmers or landless people. They are often trapped in relations of labor extraction, indebtedness, and humiliation, I should add, with upper castes and landlords. They lead a life which has no dignity, and that is continuously reproduced through practices of discrimination, stigmatization, and othering, so such as not sharing drinking glasses, the language that is used to address them, and other behavioral restrictions placed on them. They may even be coming from a context of conflict. And this I've heard quite a lot in conversations with migrant workers recently. This is something that is very rarely discussed. And it could be conflict between classes and castes, or it could be conflict over land, which is increasingly becoming an issue where there is an intense pressure on land, and land fragmentation is getting worse. And there are also references to illegality and how they want to get away from that kind of existence, where they're being pushed into illegal ways of earning money because there aren't enough jobs around in rural areas. Even though change has taken place due to education and connection with the outside world, there are backlashes against those who dare to rise above their station. So, some progress has been made, but it's a back and forth process. And remuneration for manual work is extremely poor, even in non-farm work. And practices are followed to reinforce subjugation and relations of power, such as late payment, part payment, non-remunerated work outside the job, and the way in which the payment is made in itself. So these are the little things that make a lot of difference to how people feel about being in the village. And migration is seen as a way of renegotiating these caste and class boundaries. Oh gosh, where is this cursor? So here's a little sort of graphic representation of what happens to migrants once they arrive in the city. They're often short-term or circular migrants, as I said, and they are these days increasingly traveling to work in urban industries and services such as construction work, the textile and garment industry, street vending, rickshaw pulling, and domestic work, which is a major sector for women who come from relatively disadvantaged backgrounds without a lot of formal education. And these flows are dominated by lower castes and other disadvantaged groups. They work mainly in the informal sector without proper contracts or any kind of security and job stability. These poorer migrants live on the margins of the city, both physically but also socially in a way, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail. They don't have citizenship rights due to a lack of identity documents and registration under labor laws as well. So they are basically not really part of the sort of formal structure in any sense of the word. And they are therefore unable to access social protection and welfare programs, as we've seen being sort of played out in a very sort of ugly fashion recently. So invisible migrants and hidden jobs, this is what I really wanted to emphasize today. So although physically present and in evidence everywhere, migrants are very invisibilized in many ways. So first of all, they may not exist at all on the formal books of employment, so in an industry, these people at the lowest level who are doing those dirty and dangerous jobs are not actually on the books. So for all intents and purposes, they are invisible. They may also be moved around frequently, or they are scattered, and often that is to avoid detection. It may also be because there are different projects emerging all the time, like in construction, they are being moved around by their tekidars or contractors. They may even occupy hidden spaces, such as small informal manufacturing units or construction sites, or places of home-based work. And this is actually very important and isn't recognized enough, that there are many, many, many home-based occupations. There are traditional ones like beadie making, but there are occupations where people are traveling to the city and yet are home-based. By home-based meaning they're not in a kind of, formally established manufacturing unit, but may actually be working in somebody's backyard. And that kind of arrangement seems to be happening a lot. And there's very little understanding of that. And it's also very important for women. Even the largest corporate houses have such workers at the lowest tiers of their operation. And it's not by accident that they are, in this kind of informalized, precarious situation. It's very much by design, as these are the archetypal, flexible, and exploitable workers that industry depends on so much, because they're all competing against each other. They want to keep their labor costs down. They want to be able to fire workers as and when they can. If their business contracts, as we saw during the lockdown, they have absolutely no ties to these kinds of workers, and they can let them go. They are not accountable to them. So then we keep our attention on these micro spaces of exploitation, like home-based work. So in some kinds of occupation, chains of some contracting and subcontracting mean that workers may not even know who their employer is. And it's hard for the authorities to detect them. They're kind of lost and hidden in the system. Workers at the lowest levels of manufacturing industries and construction may be kept in a bubble by their recruiters, so that they depend on them for everything. And their wages, working and living conditions are determined by these recruiters and other intermediaries. Some enterprises are extremely fragmented, where different components or stages of the production process are carried out by different groups of workers, many of whom can be home-based. I mean, we see this in the garment industry a lot, but even other kinds of occupations that are completely invisible and below the radar. I mean, for example, in some recent conversations, women were saying that they were working in soap making factories in Gujarat, for example, for soap making factories, where the raw material would be delivered home to the worker, together with wrapping paper and other equipment. And their job was to wrap these bars of soap. And then those wrapped bars of soap would be collected from them at the end of the day. I mean, these are the kinds of jobs that, the data has nothing on those kinds of jobs really. And we don't even know what these jobs are. And there's really a need to gather more detailed, very disaggregated information on this, because they're so important for poorer migrants, but they are not very visible, and the understanding at the policy level especially is very poor. So where migrant workers are positioned spatially and relationally must be understood against the backdrop of a neoliberalized and globalized economy, where there has been a progressive dilution of labor protection, and industries are engaged in the race to the bottom on labor standards. So as I said, they're all competing against each other, and labor standards are the least of their concerns. And they don't, because that means more expense basically for them. So now let's turn to policy. I hope I'm not taking up too much time. So there's weak political commitment to improving the data on circular migrants, because I mean, I've been drawing attention to this issue. Many other people have drawn attention to it as well, including Professor Bhagat, who's here today with us. And I think it's precisely because people that we are talking about belong to these excluded and invisible groups that this kind of, situation has continued for so long. More than a decade ago, I proposed a figure of 100 million circular migrants in India based on estimates by different industry. At the time, I did that to draw attention to the inadequacy of statistical estimates. Not much has changed from that time to now, but I have heard recently of plans being made to carry out industry-wise surveys. So finally, something is being done a little differently to gather more information on these lower level workers that I'm talking about, which is to be welcomed. Another major issue is that there's little understanding of why programs to protect migrant rights and welfare have performed so badly. I mean, of course, the answer lies in what I have said already. It's the systematic exclusion. It's the sort of intentional exclusion, I should say, of that poorest segment. And as everyone is aware here, I'm sure today, that the money gathered in the name of migrants, such as the Building and Other Construction Workers Access Fund, remains terribly underutilized. So there's, crores of rupees in these funds, but the sort of drawdown of those funds is very poor. And we really need to analyze the reasons for that. And there are structural reasons for that, which are not being talked about, and we do need to talk about them. So let's turn to what happened during the lockdown. So the indifference and inability to understand migration patterns and experiences, coupled with poor data, meant that the sudden emergence of millions of migrants out of the woodwork, so to speak, they were hidden up to then, but they suddenly came out during the lockdown. It came as a shock to both central and state governments. I mean, it was extremely striking that there was no knowledge of what was happening on their very doorstep. Government assistance was offered. I mean, as we know, it came a bit late, and it was structured on the assumption that migrants were either registered under the Interstate Migrant Workmen Act or BOCWA, or had identity documents on them to prove that they were Indian citizens, in need of assistance during this emergency. But a majority of them did not have those documents or were not registered under labor laws, again, for these same reasons of, the kind of social and economic and political exclusion. As it turned out, a very small percentage had those requirements in place. I mean, one of the figures that really stuck in my mind was that out of the 2 lakh or so migrant workers who are in Gujarat, who were in Gujarat at the time, only 7,000 were registered under the Interstate Migrant Workmen Act. So that's nothing, hardly any. So most of them are not. Trains were not accessible, and migrants endured unspeakable suffering and misery. It simply was not a scene we wanted to see in the 21st century in India. And everybody was, had a sense of disbelief and horror. And I'm sure government and ordinary people and everybody would never want to see that repeated again. Migrants lost faith in employers, contractors, and government. Nobody picked up the phone when they rang people they thought they had a relationship with. Some of them had been working in these companies for years, and yet their phone was not answered. They had long-standing relationships. They were owed money that they weren't paid. So they were just left in the lurch. And where could they then go? Their real safety net was their family back home in the village. And that's where they went. Many went on foot, as you know. So what do we need to do differently to stop this from happening again? So there's more need for recognition of the social and cultural processes of othering and discrimination that structure India's labor markets and welfare programs. At the same time, the benefits of migration for the poorest and most marginalized need to be recognized And the discourse needs to shift beyond distressed migration and the perpetuation of poverty and dependency. Earlier efforts through the Working Group on Migration made important suggestions related to legal protection, housing, social protection, and data. But now there's a need to address the structural causes of exclusion and precarization of India's migrant workforce at the policy level, I should say. So I believe that we need a kind of, we need a sort of broad approach which encompasses different objectives at different levels. So the first thing that needs to be done is some kind of capacity building to really understand these issues in a systematic fashion. So capacity building for middle level bureaucrats as well as researchers and NGOs who are working on migration issues, because you'll find that there are many diverse opinions on this issue. And sometimes those are not very helpful. They're inimical to actually the welfare of migrants, where there's a belief that migration is essentially a bad thing and it needs to be stopped. So I feel that there's a need to kind of, create some sort of awareness of what migration is really about. There's a need to have a sensitization program for the public. I feel that the public is very indifferent in normal times to the suffering of migrant workers, or they're ignorant about what's going on. I mean, they see, the children of migrant workers crawling in the dirt near construction sites, and I think they're at a loss as to what to do. So I think we can help the public also by sensitization programs and also information on how to help. At the policy level, there's a need for a more coherent approach across different line departments and ministries. I mean, for example, a national migration policy. Now, as Dr. Chattopadhyay said at the beginning, I have worked extensively in various African countries, and I worked very closely with the Center for Migration Research there. And together we pushed through a national policy on migration in Ghana. And that has helped to kind of create a more coherent approach in the country, bringing together these, divergent views on the issue. And that example has been so useful that other African countries in West Africa have asked them to provide them with, advice on how to bring that about in their own countries as well. I really feel that something like that is needed in India, because the different line departments and ministries speak a different language when it comes to migration. I think there should be a new working group to examine the feasibility of interstate welfare programs and safety nets, and also, other issues related to how welfare programs are being implemented at the moment. There's a need for watchdog organizations, and this could be citizens organizations, migrant associations, NGOs, to monitor the performance of schemes such as the PM Fund and other initiatives. What happened to them? How far have they been successful or not? And, IMPRI's done some surveys. That could well be something that IMPRI could take up. So on that note, I'd like to finish and thank you all for listening to me.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Deshingkar, for your very interesting and talk. As you rightly mentioned, in your lecture, it is quite evident that the migrants, they live at the margin, both physically and socially, in the Indian cities. And you also mentioned that the benefits of different welfare entitlements do not reach them due to the lack of identities and the residential proof. In fact, the living and working condition of an average Indian migrant, despite their substantial numbers, often fall well below the standard of decent work. And also you mentioned about there is little political commitment to improving them. And also you mentioned about how the migrants, they occupy the hidden spaces. There are micro spaces of exploitations. The workers, for example, you mentioned that the workers, they are not knowing who their actual employers are, and they are also engaged in activities which is practically invisible due to, for one example is that for the fragmentation of stages of production. In fact, there is a major gap in the data as they simply do not, or rather cannot count the migrants in general. For example, you mentioned about the circular migrants and the problems related definitional ambiguities which are related to the circular migrants. It is indeed difficult to count the circular migrants because of complex subcontracting practices and so on. And in fact, we saw in the immediate post-lockdown phase how the people they were scrambling around to know how many migrants need buses, the trains, and foods, and so on and so forth. And also the data on migration of women for work, they are particularly weak because they are often in less visible from the work or occupations in which they are mainly engaged. And also there is little understanding of why the program to protect migrants' rights and welfare programs they are performing so poorly. In fact, until the novel coronavirus outbreak and the consequent lockdown imposed by the government, migrant workers they lived hidden from the public gaze. And with the imposition of the lockdown, a large section of labor left, and the cities they suddenly find themselves crippled. And it is not just the resident, but the different industries. They too that they are also now feeling the pinch. And it signifies, in fact, how important their the contribution of the migrants are. And as a way forward, you rightly mentioned about there is a need for more recognition of the social and cultural processes of discrimination that structures India's labor market and welfare program. You also emphasized on the importance of capacity building for the middle level bureaucrats, and finally you argue for a national level policy of migration. So these are some of the things. So also we have a very distinguished panel of discussion. So before elaborating or before placing I have some questions, but before placing those questions, let me first move to our panel of discussion. We have Professor R.B. Bhagat, Professor Arup Mitra, and Dr. Nabila Ahmed. May I now request Arjun to introduce Professor Bhagat to make his comments on Madam's lecture. Arjun?
Yes, sure. Welcome, Professor R.B. Bhagat, but let me congratulate Professor Priya Deshingkar for very lucidly covering many points. During our last deliberation, Professor R.B. Bhagat really emotionally charged up lecture he gave during that tough time. And sir used, I would say, many harsh words to the state, to the society at large. And Professor R.B. Bhagat is Head of Migration and Urban Studies at International Institute of Population Sciences, Mumbai. Sir, over to you.
Thank you, Arjun, for inviting me and giving this opportunity. And I must thank Professor Deshingkar. She has made excellent presentation, very focused, very comprehensive, and what is today we need in respect with migrant workers and migrants. So this is fantastic, I think, and I don't have any disagreement. I support, but at the same time, I would like to look at little in a wider perspective. Not only that migration is an issue of labor migration, but it is more of a intersecting or having interface with society and politics, and of course economy when we talk about labor migrants. So today is a constitution day, and in the morning our director has led the recital of the constitution. So very important day, and when you look at our preamble of the constitution, the three words coming: freedom, equality, and fraternity. The most we have been discussing freedom. So migration may be freedom enhancing, bondage creating. For some of us who are also migrant, we have certain freedom, economic freedom, our positions are better. But for many people, it is a bondage creating. And in that respect, Professor Deshingkar has highlighted how things are becoming worse for certain category who are circular migrants, who are in a very precarious situation. So freedom part is there. Then equality, a lot of discussion goes whether migration is increasing equality or inequality. So their evidences are in conflict, are not conclusive. But there are certain philosophical and epistemological issues related with that. The most crucial thing is the fraternity, sense of belonging, where they do belong. And therefore, the issue when we talk about migration policy, what is that in migration policy that we should try to achieve? So migrants' right is nowhere recognized. I don't find any document where something is there, migrant and migrants' right is being recognized. Recently, we find something like one nation, one ration card, or rental housing for migrant worker. So migrant rights talking about, at least we are not prepared to accept. Why? There are maybe many reasons. But then we have labor rights. Labor rights are, you see, it's not applicable, or just it is a teethless for even for the non-migrant labor. What is important is the citizenship rights. Are they citizen? And therefore the question of fraternity, freedom, equality, and fraternity, sense of belonging, and therefore citizens' right, that is violated, and that is very crucial, whether migrants are citizens of this country or not. When they started walking on the roads, we realized that these are the people who are migrants. And therefore, we have to be much more, not only as a researcher, but must be a proactive in safeguarding and meeting the citizenship rights of these people who are excluded. And Professor Deshingkar has highlighted what type of exclusion is there. And very deep, if you make more and more research, and you find deeper and deeper. So that is one point. The second point is that when we talk about migration policy, there are pitfalls of migration policy. In the name of migration policy, state is using surveillance. State is restricting the freedom of the people. And therefore, we have alternative. We have to distinguish between migration and migrants. Migration is something which is our fundamental right, and it is there in the Constitution. The right to move is a fundamental right under Article 19 of the Constitution. There should not be any debate on this right. This is inalienable right. And therefore, to my mind, we should talk about policy for migrants, not a migration policy. A policy for the migrants. Why I am emphasizing this? This can make very things clear. We are talking about the migrants. Migrants is a category of citizens of this country. A category of citizens of this country whose citizenship right has not been met with, violated. So this is what. The third point I'd like to make is that everything is unfolding, as Dr. Chattopadhyay has said, that our more than 60% GDP coming from urban area. How urban transformation is going to take place. Now, nature of urban transformation, if you see, nature of urbanization, if you see, highly exclusionary. Although wealth is produced, GDP is produced. And therefore, if we want the citizenship rights of the people, of the migrants and all people are to be met with, we have to produce urban citizens. And urban citizenship should be inclusive. And therefore, we have to think about the urbanization, which is inclusive. And now there is the opportunity. Now government is talking about Atmanirbhar Bharat. Be vocal on local, but becoming vocal and local, it should be bottom up. It should be inclusive. It should be participatory. It should be people's empowerment. So these are opportunity, but it is articulated, not articulated in a better way, but it is again leading to the corporate way of being vocal on local. So I think clarity is needed, and we must have some activism, and also our research. Of course, research is very important. So I think I will stop here. With these remarks. Thank you, Professor Deshingkar. It was very nice listening to you. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. If you want to respond to Professor Bhagat's comment.
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, I can't tell you how much I'm in agreement with everything that he said. It is true, migrants are not recognized as citizens. That's the bottom line. And that's why they're constantly subject to these kind of, basically suspicious approaches, as if they don't have a right to be where they are, and they need to be guaranteed that fundamental right. And of course, urban development must become more participatory and inclusive. And I think urban planners themselves are now starting to recognize the failures in past master plans. But I think there's a problem with the power that urban authorities lack, vis-a-vis government. There is some kind of mismatch in power there, which I'm not fully au fait with. I should go into it in more detail, but they also have constraints, I understand, in being able to implement some sort of pro-migration approaches. But yeah, I'm in complete agreement. I don't have any differences with what Professor Bhagat said, and I'm glad for, migration policy or policy for migrants, which is basically what I mean. They need to be, included. They need to have a voice. They need to have they need to be able to participate in what's happening, because they never are participating. They're left out of everything. Plans are being made without them. In fact, they don't even feature. That's why I showed that image of polished, high towers in the beginning. If this is the city that's being visualized, it doesn't really have room for migrants. So the visualization, the conceptualization of cities and master plans for cities need to be rehauled completely to make them more participatory and more inclusive. So thank you very much, Dr. Bhagat.
Thank you.
I mean, Professor Bhagat. Yes.
Right. Should I go to invite, yes, our next panelist?
Yes,
Arup sir, if you are here, your camera is off.
Yes.
Professor Mitra. Yes, thank you. So, but I would just like to, interject and also add that a national policy for migrants, or that is per se, because we really don't have the count. Every time it comes, we have, 14 labor commissionerate or, state government sub-movement. But I really would like to submit to this August deliberation that the government over past few months has been making, in the process of making a national employment policy, which is constituted, and it is led by 8 union ministers, Minister of State and Minister of Independent Charge from various ministries. In fact, I remember when Professor Bhagat in September, August, when we were discussing also Professor Arup Mitra, we had, I think, our interaction and lecture that time. That was constituted, and from very high level, it came that within 2-3 months, it will also have a subcommittee to look into migrants, as Professor Deshingkar also mentioned that a committee came. Without any further ado, let me introduce Professor Arup Mitra. Professor Arup Mitra is professor at Institute for Economic Growth, IEG, New Delhi, and one of our top migration experts. Sir, over to you.
Thank you very much. It has been a great pleasure listening to ma'am. With great lucidity, ma'am has elaborated the issues, the most complex issues she has brought before us with great lucidity. And I'm very grateful to you for giving us such a clear understanding. Often we tend to believe that the migrants are engaged in wage jobs. But very rightly, you have pointed out that many of them travel to the city and they are actually engaged in home-based activities about which we have no information and about which we have no policy as such. One concern that we have huge range of intermediaries, as you have mentioned very rightly, that between the actual employer and the employees. Now, how do we tackle this situation? Now, in the context of the recent labor code reforms, mainly 4 points were mentioned. One was the wage code reform, the industrial relation code reform, and the de-skilling or the reskilling of the workers who have been retrenched by the employers. And the fourth relates to providing health and good working conditions to the workers by the employers. And in this context, I was trying to look into the details. What they say that the migrants who have come from different places and are earning less than 18,000 a month should be given certain kinds of facilities by the employers. But that's it. I mean, it doesn't really elaborate on the intricacies of capturing them, or getting them included into that entire citizenship formation program. So as Dr. Bhagat was mentioning, I get to see that there is a huge range of pitfalls within this system. And as Dr. Arjun Kumar also mentioned very rightly, that we do not actually have the correct number or the figures on migrants. On population census, you know the limitations. I don't have to tell you that how migration figures are grossly underestimated. The floating population is not at all captured. Even those who have been residing in the cities for decades are not actually captured adequately. And when it comes to the reasons for migration, etc., they are all underestimated. So I hope that the national policy on migrants will be able to look into some of these aspects. Now, finally, I have another concern, that is the exclusionary urbanization that we have been experiencing, and many of these policies do not actually have enough space to accommodate these migrants. Now, let us say that, okay, this labor code reforms are undertaken very seriously. Now they are kept in the public domain. After the feedback is collected during the November, I think they will be sent to the president for his acceptance. And after that, and subsequently, it will become the laws. Now, one important thing is that relates to the land policy. That do we actually have any space specially designated for the migrants? Now, if that is not there, then we will still be able to see dualism in the labor market, the dualism in the transport system, the dualism in the housing structures, and dualism in the access to basic amenities. So that is what keeps me bothering, that unless we have a proper land policy for the migrants, so still they will be exposed to all kinds of harassments. And simply the employment policy will not be able to take care of these aspects. Thank you very much.
Yes, ma'am, if you would like to have any comments to Professor Mitra's observation.
Definitely. Thank you, Professor Mitra, for raising some important questions here. I mean, you raised a number of questions. So let me respond to two of them, which struck me as very critical. The first is the issue of intermediaries. Now, as we all know here, intermediaries are absolutely rife in many of the kind of, migration streams involving people from remote areas who have low levels of education, who have, who don't have strong social networks in cities, who don't have the means to themselves go to the city. They don't have the money to, or the connections, or the references to get a house or get work. And that's where intermediaries become critical. So they're very important for them to access work, but at the same time, they're very well placed to exploit them. So, and for the industries also, these intermediaries are very important because they want a certain number of migrants to be supplied at a certain point in time. They depend on them. They will say, okay, get me 50 workers, now. And these intermediaries have their networks, their sub networks in villages. They have village level recruiters, or who may be ex-migrants themselves. Now, what I want to highlight here is the kind of both sides of the thing. They are very, very important for both industry in finding workers and for migrants in finding work in the city. So they are absolutely crucial for connecting them. But because of their vantage point, they can also be very exploitative. And what happens in these industries is that they hand over the whole, management of labor to them. And the intermediaries themselves may be getting paid, let's say, 1,000 rupees per worker per day, or whatever the going rate is for that industry. But by the time it translates to the actual pay packet of the worker, it could be a third of that, because they often recruit them on advances, and the advances, if you actually calculate the daily pay based on that, it's much smaller. But because of the situation of the workers that they are bringing, they are able to do that kind of exploitation. So I would say that rather than thinking about eliminating them, because they're important for connecting workers to their jobs, and they're important for ensuring that work is accessible, we should think of some kind of way of regulating them. And we know from experience that laws that attempt to regulate them have not been very successful. So there needs to be some kind of innovation there, also, in the sense that there could be rewards for those who are treat their workers well, the way that was done on environmental standards, industries who take responsibility for the welfare of their workers through contractors, could be recognized more publicly. So I think that kind of pressure, and through recognition, through public pressure, is likely to be more effective than laws, because people find a way of getting around the laws. And that's what we see repeatedly with any kind of legislation that is put in place. So that was one thing. And the other thing I think you said was that even though the new labor codes and are being developed to offer better working conditions and pay and so on, again, how do you actually ensure that those who deserve that assistance are included? And it's linked to my previous point. It's linked to the point of intermediaries. Who are the people who control them, and what can be done to make them more accountable to their workers? So these workers need our help as educated citizens or people, researchers, NGOs, who can then apply pressure on industry to comply with welfare, guaranteeing better working conditions for their workers. So the pressure has to come on the industry. And I always like to cite this example of the garment industry and what happened in Bangladesh. There was the Rana Plaza disaster. And that drew attention to the appalling conditions that those people were working in the garment industry. And it drew attention internationally, because a lot of those garment industries were supplying clothes brands in the West and in Europe. So the European consumers boycotted those products because they realized that they were being produced in sweatshop conditions and highly degrading and dangerous conditions. And then the companies applied pressure on the government and the companies in Bangladesh. So that is how it then happened. I'm not saying that it necessarily resulted in big permanent changes, but that was probably more effective than introducing some kind of law without any kind of public support behind it. Do you see what I mean? I'm trying to emphasize the importance of gaining public support for monitoring what's happening with labor conditions, working conditions. So I better stop there.
Thank you, ma'am. Yes, Professor Mitra also highlighted one very important point. But since we do not have any data or registry, National Migration Information System, something we really introduced this time. Professor Arup Mitra also highlighted this point of 18,000 rupees per month, something in the line of minimum wage. The minimum wage committee report has come, and the average wage figure was around 10,000, and the rural urban composition something. So, but yes, Professor Mitra is really highlighting, but ma'am, your point also of exclusion and inclusion of in the identification of beneficiaries, that has has been a major constraint. In that regard, we have been writing a lot for the need for requirement of data. We also have Dr. P.C. Mohanan sir here, who has been also spearheading the National Statistical Commission for a while. And sir has been also highlighting that the NSS migration survey round, which last happened in 2007-8, and also we get the census figure after such a long time, very long time. So what can be the periodicity So we were also suggesting that since this census should be affected, why not have a intercensational survey or anything, so that we as a researcher have some very important tool to look upon this thing. And and we have been highlighting during the lockdown days that to the tune of $1 a day and an Android phone, especially because you need Arogya Setu and so much, because there are so many of health and other issues. Sir also read ARHC, but let us go to our next panelist here. Soumyadip sir, why don't you introduce Dr.
I just wanted to briefly interject. I wanted to respond to your point about the intercensal survey. Vietnam did this in, I think, 2004. They had a specifically designed, a migration survey, because let's remember that neither the NSS nor the census are designed as migration surveys, so there's a limited amount of information that they can gather about the kind of intricacies of migration. But if there's a specifically, designed migration survey, you're bound to get more rich in data. And the government of Vietnam did that. It's one of the few governments in the world that has done this intercensal survey on migration for the country, so it's a very important resource. Just wanted to say that in response to what you just
Let me also briefly, ma'am, add one thing. I think Professor Bhagat can highlight more on this. Sir, whenever we talk about this migration policy or data, one aspect kick in very, hugely, which is the issue of informal workers. So most of our, migration thing gets, lost into that, and then we do not have any labor. The government has also now announced one more committee to look into to procure this sort of data, but largely on informal sector workers in cities. Professor Amitabh Kundu is also co-chair of that committee. Yes. Details are yet to be out. Yes. Soumyadip sir, why not to, yes, please introduce.
Well, so now I request Dr. Nabila Ahmed to please offer your comments. So just before, Dr. Nabila Ahmed is associated with Sheffield Institute of International Development, University of Sheffield. So it's over to you, Dr. Ahmed.
Hello, yes, thank you. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Thank you so much for inviting me, IMPRI, and I'm delighted to be here. I won't take up too much time because I know we're at the end of the hour, but I wholeheartedly agree with everything, obviously, Professor Deshingkar has said. I'm a former student of hers, so that's not a surprise. And also, obviously, with what everyone on the panel has said, in particular, Professor Bhagat, who's also informally been a supervisor of mine in the past. So I'm really also glad that every time I had a thought, Dr. Kumar or another panelist kind of raised it already. So all I wanted to add was really something around the kind of new policy directions that Professor Deshingkar presented at the end. And we call them new policy directions, but actually, I mean, I've been working on this since 2012. Obviously, Priya has been working on this for much longer, and others as well, but none of the issues actually seem to have changed. What's happening this year and what has happened since April 2020 is they have been exposed and highlighted. But a lot of these issues in terms of exclusion, inclusion, negative public attitudes, poor policy formulation, lack of data, invisibilization of migrants have been ongoing for decades, to be honest. What's happening now is there's greater attention. So it's good to mobilize this for policy influence if it's possible. And there's two main issues I wanted to raise. The first, related to all the issues that have already been raised. The first is this tension between interstate and intrastate migration, right? We don't have sufficient data on these numbers. I mean, there are estimates and, I think they vary from about 10% of all migration within India to much more, but we don't have a full understanding of what's happening with the interstate migration. And due to that, we don't have a very clear or robust systematic solution to the problems faced by interstate migrants, right? So my work primarily focuses on access to the PDS amongst migrants, access to social protection. But while there are many exciting new policies in place, including One Nation, One Ration Card, they're primarily being implemented at the intrastate level. And I know that One Nation, One Ration Card was designed to increase portability of access amongst labor migrants. To date, even though discussion started in 2018, there hasn't really been any record of success in terms of being able to access rations, PDS, and so on, once a migrant leaves the place of destination, because they don't have, because obviously right now, everything is linked to the Aadhaar card. So while these problems have persisted over the years, they've changed in the way they've become arguably more difficult because of the direction towards digitization. So, I mean, that warrants a whole other discussion, which we may not have time to go into here, but that kind of tension between intrastate and interstate governance of migration is something we really have to think about if we're going to solve these issues of exclusion. And then finally, just the question of gender. It's been raised to some extent, but also I was looking at some of the research being done by IMPRI as well, in terms of the upcoming issue of food security. We're going to see another devastating kind of occurrence of food insecurity, particularly amongst labor migrants because of the pandemic. And we all remember seeing in the news around April that a lot of migrants who were leaving, they called it the exodus, were saying it's either COVID or it's hunger. It's either COVID or dying of starvation. So obviously we have to think about that not only prioritizes the importance of programs like PDS, but also we have to think about the dynamics within the household and the kind of invisibilization of women migrants within the overall invisibilization of migrant data, and what kind of impacts the pandemic and kind of underlying challenges regarding migration are going to have, because, already we have the devastation of COVID, but together with food insecurity and ineffective kind of social protection policy, it's a huge concern. So I don't know if we have time to go into all of that, but it'd be great to hear some thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmed. We really highlighted the point of thalinomics, which came in the last economic survey, and learn from there, because the ration really one also gets in the villages. But I would say this new India is aspirational, and people also want to eat good, and not just, because most of what people are getting now, they are having 45, 55, 60 kgs of rice at their house. And then, selling back. Many stories, many professors and researchers have been highlighting, be it Andhra, be it North. Now people are also selling it on, on a much lower cost to get some cash or even get rid of it. But there are also a chunk of population which really require those. Prof Priya Deshingkar, if you would allow, we can have some input from more of our discussants, and then you can choose to answer if we can incorporate some more voices.
Okay, sure.
Sure. Soumyadip sir.
Okay, so then just let me request Dr. Simi Mehta, who is the CEO of IMPRI, to chip in and make her comments.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Deshingkar. It has been so fascinating to hear you and all the respected panelists for intervention. In fact, some of my discussion points have already been spoken, and in part also by Dr. Nabila just now. So it might be a repetition, and I would be really quick in making my discussion points. So ma'am, the implications of environmental changes and extreme weather events have often led to the creation of environmental refugees, whom I like to refer to them as survivors of environmental change. In fact, the word refugees very much comes from the coloniality of language. In fact, it is they who are the migrants who form a part of the migrant lot in the urban and peri-urban spaces, who in fact again become the agencies for the neo-colonial exploitation. As you mentioned, that there is a race to reach to the bottom of the labor concerns. And then there is another added dimension on women who are faced with a double dilemma on account of the normative societal subjugation, and also in facing the brunt of the policy neglect of their basic human rights, be it on food, clothing, shelter, and etc., etc. So I would again, I resonate what Dr. Nabila had to say, that women actually form a part of becoming further invisible in the whole lot of invisible migrants to the city. So in this, how can we move towards or move forward with the agenda of New India and Atmanirbhar Bharat, given such inherent structural inequities? And quoting Professor Bhagat on the occasion of Constitution Day, in fact, it actually creates the whole idea of we the people and they the people. Compromising the whole objectives of the constitutional objectives, rather, of securing justice for the people, social, economic, and political. So your views on that, ma'am. Over to you, Dr. Soumyadip. Thank you so much for your wonderful lecture.
Thank you, Simi. Even I wanted to ask this question to Professor Priya Deshingkar because of a global wow. Because ma'am has really highlighted this precarious condition. Do you see now in 2020 this especially happening in South Asia more, other than Africa, Latin America, or other parts of the world? Is it now becoming a very a unique issue in South Asia, be it because our labor market is really informal? I'm not just limiting ourselves only to India. And there has also been the issue of the South Asian migrants. Professor Vidya Rajan have not been able to join because he has been highlighting this issue, that those who has been working in Middle East or other places, they have not got wages or many things they have returned. Those issues from international migration is also coming. Inter-district migration and many things we have talked. Let me quickly go to our next panelist, Mr. Samir Unle, sir. Sir, are you there? Yes, your video is off.
Yeah, actually, as always, I'm traveling, so the video is off.
Let me briefly introduce, sir. Ma'am, at the state level, during this pandemic, what has happened, this exodus of migrant workers, many state governments have constituted Palayana Ayog, and a lot of active things were also being done. But there has been a lot of movement, and I would also say positive story, constructive work from the city governments. So to have the point also from the administration, we have Mr. Samir Unle, who is now the Joint Commissioner of Department of Municipal Administration at Government of Maharashtra. Prior to this, Mr. Samir Unle was also CEO, Smart City of Thane City in Mumbai metropolitan region, and sir, a vast experience in working with the city governments, also in India and also with many city governments abroad. So without wasting any further time, Samir sir, over to you.
Arjunji, thank you very much for this opportunity to interact. I think all of us are migrants. Maybe the word differs is socio-economic status. Those who are well educated, those who are economically well off may not feel the pang of being a migrant. But all of us at some stage or continue to be migrant. That was my first take over here. Secondly, as a species, we are extremely territorial. So the territorial instincts are quite strong. And therefore, this us and they, this part is a recurrent theme in any discussion that we do across cultures and across geographies and probably across times. Third input actually was Simi ma'am mentioned about environmental refugees or migrants. Probably what we witness now along with the seasonal migration was this pandemic migration, in which the fear psychosis was so strong that somehow it was more of a mob behavior by the way people interacted. There were people so moving, and it was quite a sight. And the media was also extremely, point to highlight the miseries which really came up, and immediately the administration also responded in whatever force it could do onto that. Migration and urbanization are very closely linked. We cannot think of any city or a city region without considering migration. And maybe just two examples probably I could share was one, probably Mumbai was one of the first areas probably in which we had a rental housing policy under the Mumbai metropolitan region. It was announced in 2008, in which the rental housing was made precisely to take care of the younger migrants laborers for opportunity for them to stay. So this was one of the examples which indicates something was done for the considering the migrant issue. Secondly, the slums and slums issues of most of the cities do come up because of there is no appropriate, as was rightly mentioned, land policy or a proper framework to take care of the migrant labor who are important engines of the city growth. So we will have to think of more humane and compassionate programs and a broader paradigm to consider every possible people who are coming in. I know it is a bit idealistic, and not every time we can have the luxury of morality. Finance goes strong, and then obviously the more closer people get greater resources, and the other people are left outside. So that is an inevitable part of human nature, and especially group behavior or of any denomination that we might think of. But yes, the way urbanization is going to grow and has been growing, migration will have to be a very important part of that. And any issues that we discuss when we talk of inclusion, probably including the migrants, is also a important part that we'll have to pay. It's an evolving field, and at the resources that are available at city level, probably we'll have to think of some proper and good models in which cities can take care of our migrant. I must use the word brothers and sisters who at this moment might be migrant as we were probably a decade back. So Arjun, thank you. These are very limited points I wanted to share on the intersection of cities and migration. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir, for also putting across the administrative side of view. Let me quickly go to Dr. Ziming Lee, who is joining us from Wuhan. Ziming, are you here? Yes, let me introduce Ziming. Yes, Ziming was a researcher at University of Florida in their Department of Urban and Design. Now, Ziming is currently faculty at Wuhan University. Ziming, welcome, and why don't you go on? Yes, we are not able to hear you. Yes, Ziming. I think now it's.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Please go on.
Okay. Thank you for your introduction. And I have several questions based on the comparison between China and India. Once I studied on the slum situation in India, but I find that the migration situation is worse because many generations spend their life in cities as the blue-collar worker, or even working as the informal laborers, but their children, the grandchildren, they don't have enough social mobility, so they stay in the lowest level of the society. So my question is, so what's the problem between the infrastructure provision and the taxation collection from this group in India? And is there any roles that NGOs or some other power that could help them to accumulate education, accumulate the human capitals, and help them to have a higher social mobility? And the second question is, we already look at the aspect of a production that the migrant workers that they can contribute to the economy. But what about the consumption contribution they can bring to the cities? Because they are the potential group that can generate a lot of consumptions. And then this is the whole circle of the macroeconomy. And then what is the how to say, the similarities between China's migrant problems and the Indians' migrant problem? This is what I want to find. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ziming Lee, for being so brief. We have PC Monan sir. Monan sir, if you'd like to chip in. Yes, your camera. Yes, please, sir. Yes.
I must apologize, Dr. Arjun, because I logged in late and missed the main portion. So it's not fair that I make any comments, But anyway, one issue which I wanted to flag, which is of main concern is, as all of you are aware, the migration is one of the major topic of discussion. But in the last few months, we have heard from many of the state governments passing laws restricting employment for outside people, which is a very major issue, which is likely to have an impact on migrants from interstate migration. We have seen at least 4 state governments passing legislations recently: Madhya Pradesh, Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka, and I think 4 of them, and many other state governments almost coming out with the idea that they should restrict employment to this. So this is a major concern because maximum migration takes place for economic reasons. And if this kind of populist schemes are likely to have an impact on migration and lead most of the migration is then will go to the informal sector, because formal sector, if the manufacturing sectors, others are concerned about these laws, the migrants will be forced to go to still informal side, and that is my major concern. I don't know that this was a part of your plan to discuss today, but this is an important issue that has come to the fore, and which will have a very serious implication. I'm sorry I missed I knew it's a very important and interesting discussion.
Yes,
Thank you.
Sir has been writing a lot on this issue, but sir really raised a very important question, which I also wanted to get into the deliberation here and also to submit it to Prof Priya Deshingkar. That ma'am, a lot of this migration, since it is happening in informal sector, it is also I would say heavily led by young men. Almost 90% of the migrants, and the age bracket is really 15 to 17 to 30. How do you see that? Because that is really the invisible character which is coming. Ma'am, you can choose to answer. Dr. Soumyadip, I think your question and some of also my question, we can go next. Ma'am, you can
fine.
Yes,
Fine.
yes. Please.
So should I start answering now?
Please, ma'am.
Yes, please.
Yes.
I mean, I made a note of key points raised by all the different speakers, and I'll try my best to answer them.
I did not want you to change the page because there are so many. Yes.
So I'll start with what Nabila said, and I think she raised a very important issue, which is to do with ensuring that this proper kind of, portability between states. So what about, ensuring rights for interstate migrants? Because even now with this one ration card for the country, actually, it's still not implemented, but it's not clear whether and how this can be done across states. And I remember attending a meeting with different line departments and the Food Corporation of India in, it was either in Jaipur or Bhopal many years ago, more than 10 years ago, where this issue was discussed. And according to the FCI officials, it's very, very difficult to do because of the way that quotas are allocated, the way that grain is drawn down from the Food Corporation of India. So it's not a simple issue to address, but this needs to be brought up and discussed properly. So that was a very important point that Nabila raised there. Then Dr. Mehta talked about climate refugees and whether this is an issue that's important across South Asia, if I understood correctly. And I think it is certainly an important issue, and there has been quite a lot of research, especially in Bangladesh, because it's a low-lying country. But it could be an issue in parts of India as well, because the thing with gradual onset climate change is that it's not like a cyclone where you can see the immediate impact. Gradual onset means droughts can be getting longer or worse, but you can't separate that out from many other factors which also contribute to migration. So I have a big problem with the climate and migration discussion for that reason, because it tends to attribute migration to climate change and also uses climate projections and models to try and predict how many people are going to migrate. And those models are ridiculous in my opinion. So climate is certainly an issue, and climate change is real. Policymakers need to take it seriously, and people are already adapting, and that's what farmers are best at, adapting to the climatic conditions. They may be changing cropping patterns, they may be moving out of agriculture, all kinds of things are happening. And it will contribute to migration in some way, but it can't be seen as the only factor that's leading to migration. Then Mr. Unhare raised some interesting points actually, and I'm very grateful because, I don't really get a chance to interact with government officials directly very often. So every interaction like that is precious. I see he's not here, but I wanted to ask him if we can access documents about Mumbai's rental housing policy for 2008. Maybe Dr. Arjun Kumar could help me on that. I'm very interested in learning more because, we can see if that was done with migrants in mind, it's certainly something that we can learn from. And then Dr. Ziming Lee, raised some interesting questions about comparing the situation in China and India. I mean, the fundamental difference, of course, is your hukou system and us not having any such system. In India, the constitution gives everybody the right to move and work wherever they want to. So there are no restrictions. Of course, in practice, there are a number of restrictions because your ration card is tied to where you live. Many other kinds of benefits are tied to basically your domicile. So you may have the right to live and work and move around, but there could be some other issues and barriers related to the way you can access government support as a migrant. And that's hardly ideal. You made the point about the social mobility of migrants' children and grandchildren. I disagree when you say that their children are not socially mobile. I actually think they are quite mobile because one of the things that migrants do is when they send their remittances home, I've seen this across many locations in India and other countries like Myanmar and various other countries that I've worked in. Migrants invest in education, and they are sending their children to English medium schools. They're very highly aspirational for the future of their children. They always say, we don't want our children to become laborers like us. So this generation is breaking that pattern. Historically, they may not have been very mobile, but they are mobile now. They are socially mobile. Through education, they are able to go through those sort of caste and class barriers that they were facing in previous generations. Of course, it's, as I was saying in my talk, it's a back and forth process. It's not smooth sailing for them by any means, but they are investing in that and it is happening. And they are finding jobs that are, sort of low level office jobs. Even in the informal sector, they may have better jobs than their parents with more stability and better pay, and they are associating with a slightly higher class of people. So that is the social mobility that I am seeing. Of course, migrants are important consumers, as you rightly point out, and informally there are a number of services and markets that have been set up to cater explicitly for migrants coming into an area. And so that hasn't gone unnoticed for business people. They know that they are consumers and they do cater to them as consumers. But of course, it's not, reflected in national statistics in any way. So that is an important point that you raised. Thank you very much. Then Professor P.C. Mohanan talked about states passing laws that restrict employment to outsiders. I think that's an absolutely critical issue. I presume you're talking about formal jobs rather than informal jobs, if I understand you correctly. And that is introducing, the kind of politics that you see between countries in a way. They are creating barriers for other people and coming and working in formal jobs. So yes, of course, that is creating a kind of protectionism of their labor market because they don't want outsiders to come and take the jobs that they want their own people to have. So that, of course, does raise some questions about whether or not it's a sound policy. And that's not my area of expertise, I have to say. It's something you have raised, an important issue, but I tend to work with people who are working in the informal sector and who belong to those kind of dispossessed classes at the bottom. of the pile. And as far as I know, there are no restrictions being placed on them coming because they need their cheap and disposable labor. And they are being welcomed by industry, not so much by politicians, because they like to fuel people's insecurities about migrants, but certainly industry wants them. And finally, Dr. Kumar made this point about migration being male dominated. Now, I would say this is very much a function of statistics. Statistics tell us that it's male dominated. But of course, statistics do not properly understand patterns of female migration, and they're extremely invisible in numbers. There is a lot of female migration happening, but it's simply not reflected in statistics because of the kinds of jobs that they do. I mean, informal estimates of domestic workers, for example, are that in India we have something like 90 million domestic workers. There are no formal data on that. Hardly any data exists on this huge sector of occupation, occupation for women. That's just one example. Women are migrating for all kinds of jobs, but no one really knows what they are. We know we have some micro examples based on the detailed studies that we academics carry out, and we know from other academics what they're finding in their areas, but nationally there's no representation of that. So I would dispute the statement that migration is male dominated. I mean, we all know about marriage migration, that's in the numbers already, but migration for work is not properly reflected in the figures, and it is not male dominated. I mean, it may still be male dominated, but not to the extent that we think. There are many women out there who are migrating autonomously, not just with their husbands. They're going by themselves. I mean, I saw it in all the villages that I've worked in, groups of young women. I mean, just to give you some examples, there are groups of young women traveling from Andhra Pradesh to Mumbai to do tile work. You may not even know of this occupation. This is kind of fine mosaic tile artwork. And they grow in groups that are very young, almost teenagers. Where are they in the national statistics? There are many other occupations and groups of women and girls that are traveling for different kinds of work. We don't know what that work is on the national level. There are specific examples coming from different places, but no kind of overall understanding of the pattern.
Thank you. Yes, I'll just add one point that we also did many surveys, especially during last few years. And ma'am, I really work on housing and urbanization a lot. So I also have some of my papers on rental housing in EPW and many other places as well. And I will contact Samir sir. He was there when this Mumbai, the time you mentioned, we really had one very good panel discussion on rental housing. Where he also presented also Professor Piyush Tiwari, those who are all expert, and also participant from HUDCO, from government side, who also presented the rationale for the ARHC. I will share with you. One thing I really wanted to also highlight that based upon our work with ActionAid, IGSSS, all the civil society organization, we tried to make a draft rental housing policy for government of Delhi. But before the election, that was, and we saw levers that what can be utilized, especially for these informal sectors. And what we recommended that the amount of 1,500 for dormitory and other things, there is a lot of demand. But the two issues which come really very hard, one is of operation and management, and second is of political will. So that is something at local level, since most of the issues we are also seeing coming here. HUDCO system, China, I would really love to go there some other day for the point of discussion. But Ziming, thank you for coming and raising this point. Dr. Soumyadip Chattopadhyay, over to you. You have been waiting very patiently.
No, thank you. It's also, so I'm also listening to all the experts. So actually, I have a couple of like 3-4 questions. Let me keep it short. Recently, Zondres has proposed for a decentralized urban employment and training. It's called DUET. And it seems that the proposal has certain important features like the expansion of public work scheme to absorb the slack in the urban casual labor market, then the possibility of improving the quality of local public infrastructure, then there is a proposal for setting up of worker cooperatives as placement agencies and so on. So how far it would be effective in addressing the present challenges, since many of the most vulnerable urban workers who can benefit from it are likely to be the migrants. So this is question one. And secondly, what is your thought, ma'am, on the necessity and usefulness of say formalizing some parts of the informal economy in the city? For example, in India, in many cities in India, they have no proper regular trash collection system, but they have thousands of independent pickers, waste pickers. So they are often migrants, they are often very poor. They just sort the city's waste and sell whatever they could. Now, would then it be useful to reach them officially in the form of, say, by providing some training or some financial assistance, or to say hire them directly? So if this can be done. Another thing is that there's a lot of discussion which is related to the relationship of the migrants with the cities. And just I was looking at one of the most recent reports by Ajivika Bureau. So there I have found out that a large number of migrants, they are actually viewing the city as a site to maximize their saving to be invested in their villages. So and that is why the migrant families, they live sometimes in the open or in some other rented accommodation, not so well, so to save the money. So when say some of the basic services like sanitation facilities and all these things are available in certain areas on a pay and use basis, so they defecate in the open, and the circular migrants, particularly those belonging to the SC/ST communities or the Adivasis, they are unlikely to make certain permanent claims to the city. So instead of considering these type of coping strategies, if we see the official policy rhetoric, they mainly focus on, say, for open defecation free zone or beautification projects and so on. So do you think that any policy, because when we are talking about the national national policy for migrants, so do you think any such policies of the workers must recognize these coping strategies which are sort of informed by migrants' own logics, their processes and their relationship that they have developed in the city? And finally, on a larger scale, if we see the economic characteristics of the cities, then the service and jobs they are disproportionately concentrated in the big Indian cities. So do you think that the policies to facilitate a more distributed pattern of urbanization by emphasizing on the so-called secondary cities could be useful? So these are some of my questions. So your thoughts on this?
Yes, but ma'am, let me first really ask you that should we extend the session by 10-15 minutes? This is really excellent. We are learning a lot.
Yeah, I think for another 10-15
yes,
minutes,
sure.
fine, but not
sure.
more.
So that we can, for one minute, also listen to Professor R.B. Bhagat and Professor Mehta. Yes, they are with us. And one thing, this point sir has, Dr. Soumyadip sir has really raised, Delhi government has done something like online job fair, where it is being, also said that more than 2 million jobs has been given during this pandemic in last several months. So that has been, sir, also used Delhi as a case study and other places. But when we see the plight of the process, how it is going, then we really see all the media channels also reporting that are really not up to mark, and the process is so cumbersome that not even the migrants like to go there just to get into that. Nevertheless, Professor Utpal Dey is joining us from Northeastern Hill University, Shillong, Nehu. Also, we thought to have some voice from Northeast as well. Divya Verma ma'am from Ajika Bureau, I spoke to her this morning. She has sent her best wishes. Also, Dr. Devolina Kundu and they had some prior engagements, said they could not come. So they have sent the best regard to you, ma'am. Professor Utpal Dey, over to you. Yes, your video and your mic. Professor Dey, yes. So please try to be brief. Yes, please unmute yourself. Professor Dey, please unmute yourself.
Now I
think you can hear me, no?
We can.
Yes, somehow I could manage to join because my video was not getting on.
Okay.
So much of the lecture I could not follow earlier because I did not join. So only and now only discussion part mainly I joined, and I saw threadbare and a lot of issues has been discussed. And lastly, that Arjun mentioned that Delhi government also has online portal now that job seekers can apply through that, even the migrants also. All these empirical and other issues I am not going, just looking at the recent few months scenario. Just what I felt is that the fundamental thing that initially in the 18th and 19th century, so there was the disguised unemployment in the rural areas, as in the book we studied, and that led to the migration of people in search of better job opportunities in the town or urban areas, and contribute to the development in the urban cities. So it is a disguised unemployment pushed them for them, and migration took place. And international level, another thing that some countries, they only restrict this migration, allow the qualified people, so that human resource percentage increase in those countries and different. And some countries, they need even for their basic works, unskilled works, they allow them to go. So there different happens, but in the countries, within the country, if we see that unemployment push from rural to urban. And in the pandemic situation, what happened? That people are forced because of the closure or other thing to the rural areas, and that created disguised unemployment in the rural areas because they had to join the job in the rural area, but much of the job not available. So agriculture was the only option. And so now the intensity of disguised unemployment intensified. Now question is, at the same time, in order to accommodate them, several state governments started local level some job creation procedure. Even Manrega also widened, no? Definitely they are getting relatively less wages. But the question now will come that gradually when the urban activities opened up, already some opened up, industries opened up, businesses opened up, those who were working as a vendor, street food seller, all the many such things. So they came back. Now looking at even after staying some decades, they forced to came back, and that in their mind still now it is very fresh. So when there will be need for the laborers in the urban area, whether this re-migration, how it will happen. And because of that, at the countryside also for providing some job opportunities, as there is an effort from all the government side, because this is related to their political prospects also of many of the state governments. And another thing is that simultaneously, as earlier one speaker mentioned, that some state governments are debarring, as you said, only the formal jobs, that government jobs, there is a quota. Maharashtra said, Gujarat said,
Haryana,
some other states, Andhra Pradesh, that job will be primarily preference given to the state people. But question is not that. Even in informal sector also, when from Bihar somebody will go to Punjab now and open some street food shops, the political pressure will be there not to give them or allow them to function, rather the local people can get that work. So this type of situations may come, and it is coming in some places. So these migrations, which was considered to be development oriented or for the development, now it is going backward, like in many cases. So how you see this thing?
Thank you.
Much other things I don't want to speak on.
Thank you, Professor Professor Deshingkar, thank you for listening to all of us very patiently. 2 points really, because our institute is impact and policy, so it will be not good to leave policy. The economic survey really is very creative document nowadays, and I'm sure on this issue, they will come up and cover a lot of things. And related with the economic survey, of course, is the budget dimension. Ma'am, how do you see what should be done, and what should be the institutional mechanism, not only just for India, but also at a global scale, because this migration issue, be it international, internal, this has been highlighted, and ma'am, you are really leading in this aspect globally. Ma'am, how do you see a renewed focus on this migration, opportunity, fraternity, citizenship, many things our panelists are also raising, should be there, and that push should become the center stage? Ma'am, over to you. You can choose to answer anything, and also, ma'am, conclude. Then once we will go to Professor Bhagat and Professor Mitra, if you allow. Yes, ma'am.
Of course. Yeah, so let me briefly try and reply to all the points that were put to me. So first, starting with Dr. Chattopadhyay's questions related to, say, waste pickers in cities, whether it would help to offer them some training or bring them under the fold of the formal institutional setup in some way. I think what you need to remember is that the poor often have an adversarial relationship with formal institutions. They don't like them because of the way that they have been treated, so they will do everything to avoid them. And that is another reason why intermediaries are so important, because they help them basically relate to these institutions and government officials and so on, and they can't deal with cumbersome procedures because everything is so complicated. Intermediaries are also used to fill out forms, as you know very well, for any number of applications, and that refers also to the point that Dr. Kumar was making about the online portal and cumbersome procedures. So there is that kind of adversarial relationship that we have to recognize. So I don't think that's going to work very well. What I think would help them is if they are unionized, and they do have unions, they do have associations. So what we can do is to not prevent those unions from operating, because there is a move to interfere with unions or prevent them in some places through some government moves, as I understand it. Certainly some industries definitely exercise that kind of restriction on workers unionizing, and that's a very important way for them to mobilize collective their voice or protest against working conditions and the way they are being treated. So I would say that they should be allowed to exercise their rights collectively, to voice their concerns, to unionize. That would be a very important thing. Now, when it comes to low cost housing, somebody raised the issue of migrants using the city to maximize their earnings. I think it was you, Dr. Chattopadhyay, again. That's very true. The Kholi system in Mumbai and other places, where 8 migrants will share one room. 4 migrants in the daytime, while the night shift people, I mean the day workers are out, and then 4 workers at night, and they have all of their meager possessions in a bag or two, and that's it. They're there literally to earn. They try and remit as much as possible. So they are very much in the city to maximize their earning opportunities, and the way they use housing is also quite important. Now, I have seen in interviews that I've had with migrant workers, where they say that most of the time we stay, with our fellow workers in colis and rented accommodation in very crowded situations like that. But when the wives are visiting the city, they will rent a separate room in the slum or somewhere, so they want some privacy. They want to be able to spend some time with their family. So they use housing in different ways as well. Again, I don't think any of the policies are talking about this kind of different pattern of usage of housing and open spaces. Like you say, these open spaces are not just coping mechanisms. They may be, cost saving mechanisms as well. And these open areas are like common property resources, for people in the city. So their right to the land also has to be recognized, and their use of the land, and different ways in which they engage with the city has to be understood fully. So that was one response to what you were saying. Then there's this issue of the big city focus, in migration. So all the migrants flocking to big cities, Now here, I think the example of China would be very important because they actually, through the kind of rural industrialization programs, did deflect some of that pressure away from big urban cities and create magnets for migrant workers in other parts of the country. And I'm sure Ziming Lee could say a lot more about that than I can. So there are examples where that has been done successfully. So then turning to the points made by Professor Day, these points related to the unemployment moving from rural areas to urban areas. I'm not so sure about that argument myself. A lot of people migrate even into informal jobs because they get more work in the city. There's simply the bottom line. They get more regular days of work when they are in the city. They may be out of work in rural areas, but they're certainly not out of work in urban areas. All of them tell us that we're working an average of 5 days a week. Some factory workers are trying to work overtime and even more than 5 days a week. So of course, it does depend a bit on how well that factory is doing at that point in time. But the overall pattern is that they are getting more regular work. So it's not just the fact that they're getting paid more. There are other things, more regular work. And they also get paid a monthly salary quite often, so it's not a piece rate arrangement, which they complain about in rural areas and non-farm work, so there are definitely, I would say that that's the pattern that I have observed. And as to them coming back now, even after having experienced that horrible situation during the lockdown, it's true. They don't see a future in the villages, which is why they left in the first place, for a variety of social and economic reasons related to their exclusion, which is what my talk was about. So they are going back, and in some ways they're eating humble pie. They don't necessarily want to go back to the very same employers who, didn't fulfill their sort of patronage promises to them when the lockdown was happening. But they know that और कोई चारा ही नहीं है, they have to go back. There is nothing in the village for them. And some of them say that they've kept relations going with their employers, and they regret having gone back in such a hurry because, there was fear, because after the first month of the lockdown, all sources of help dried up for many of them. And they were left with no understanding of what was going on. There was widespread panic, and they just took to the road, and so many of them walked back, as you know. But then when it was all over, the employers were ringing them up because they have the phone numbers for all of them, the thekedars and the intermediaries and all that. And then, you may have seen these videos of farmers like distributing sweets to the workers when they came back, garlanding them and, giving them a huge warm welcome when they went back. I don't know if this actually means in better working conditions or more wages, but certainly, they were sort of, they were welcomed back because, of course, the employers also recognized that they were nowhere without these workers. Their businesses were suffering. So it cuts both ways. So, that's what's happened. And many of them have gone back now. And finally, yes, Dr. Kumar's big question about the budget and what we should do through institutional mechanism. I mean, that's really difficult to answer, like off the top of my head right now. But what I would say is that rather than channeling all resources through the state, and state institutions for migrant worker welfare and programs and interventions, I think more resources should be made available to people who can work with migrant workers more closely, and that includes a number of committed NGOs. I mean, there are well-known ones like Ajivika Bureau and so on who are quite well resourced already, but there are a number of poor organizations, that are also working with migrant workers. And maybe a fund needs to be set up for smaller organizations, and the allocation of funding could be done in a transparent fashion, so I mean, I know that lists are maintained on the better NGOs and, to eliminate fake NGOs. So I know that this kind of activity is done by the government all the time. So there are legitimate NGOs out there who have worked with communities for a number of years, who have built up relationships of trust with communities. These are the organizations that are starved of resources. They need funding, they need money, and government should seriously think of them as partners. Yeah, these are the people who are going to help in getting that agenda forward of helping migrants to have a better experience in cities, to help them access what the government wants to give them in the first place. I mean, sometimes the government programs are there, but nobody knows which programs are. Even government officials themselves may not know. So, all that needs money also to improve the record on that. So that's all I can say about that.
So, well, thank you, Professor Deshingkar. So it's really an engrossing session, but at the same time, we are really running short of time. So I just quickly go to Professor R.B. Bhagat just for his quick comments or anything. Maybe a minute.
Thank you very much. It was quite learning. Lot of comments I could hear, and it is quite enlightening. But very quickly, we have to. There enormous challenges are there. And one of the challenges is there a partnership in the knowledge production about the migration and migrants. So for example, one of the barrier comes that we are discussing a lot here, but next day or next group of people, academician will say that it is a problem of poverty. So urban poverty, you tackle, problem of migration is not a problem. You tackle informal sector. So when you are talking about informal sector subsumes migrant workers. Why to talk migrant workers? No, this disappears. That is what. But pandemic has brought a momentum and understanding about the migrant situation. And this situation is there. Migration stands, and migrant stands as a theoretical category, as a part of the social theory. And that is about space and place. Poverty is not simply a spillover of rural poverty to urban poverty. Urban place producing poverty. So it is sometimes we have a misunderstanding, a group of academicians like us and you, that yes, it is a rural poverty that is getting into urban poverty. So poverty being multidimensional, there are various things. So space and place producing poverty. Similarly, the informality. Informality is also produced by space and place and space-time restructuring. What Professor Deshingkar said, that the production process getting dispersed, and there is a flexible mode of labor exploitation. Well, how does a flexible mode of labor exploitation takes place? If you see, spatially distributed, spatially decentralized way in multiple locations, but centralized in the big city. Everything coming in. So we have to have a group of us, academician must have a voice. And this migrant identity or a theoretical, it must be integrated into theoretical framework. And it must not be lost that it is an issue of poverty simply or informal migrant. So this is one. Secondly, we have a great now government is now thinking about like one nation, one ration card and this rental housing for the migrant worker and something more regarding children's education when the children migrate along with their parents, etc. Health is something where easily can be included. So this momentum, I think our effort should be there, that how to articulate or how to design, as Professor Deshingkar has already said, it's a great challenge that one nation, one ration card. It's not an easy thing. Rental housing for the migrants. It is not an easy thing, but there is some hope is there, some understanding is there, and there is a need to contribute. And lastly, let me tell you, ultimately we are talking about inclusion, and there is a lot of tension between center and state, migrants' right, and ultimately migration becomes, it's not only international, internal migration also. It's a political question. So that we have to recognize, not a domain of only economists or a demographer, but also political scientist. And therefore, our understanding and our partnership is very, very multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary partnership is very, very important. So thank you very much. Time is very short. So it's a quite enlightening.
Yes, thank you, Professor Varghese. So now I request Professor Mitra to make very quick comments, maybe a minute or so. Professor Mitra.
He's there. Yeah.
Professor Mitra.
Sorry,
Yes.
there is connectivity problem. So
Yes, please.
Okay, yes, sir.
Yes.
Oh, sir has been muted again. Sir, kindly unmute. Professor Mitra.
Yeah, no, I'm not able to speak much right now because there is connectivity problem.
Okay, sure.
Very frequent disruptions. So it's all right. It's all right.
Okay, thank you. So Professor P.C. Mohanan, if you please.
Yes.
No, I think a lot of interesting points have come up, and I don't want to quote any individual or personal anecdote evidence, which everywhere around me I find it. Kerala is where I'm staying currently. We have a huge migrants population from other states. So let me not go into all those issues currently. Let me thank the organizers and the speakers for giving some very good ideas. Thank you.
So well then thanks to all of you. And if I just conclude, there are mainly 3-4 broad takeaways from this discussion. It seems to me like, firstly, this crisis should spur the government to collect better data and work closely with the other stakeholders who have close ground level connections. And secondly, it is extremely important or crucial to offer the India's migrants a better social safety fallback so that they can avert the threat of long-term unemployment. And thirdly, the failure to recognize migrants as a stakeholder in the urban development seems to be one of the biggest mistakes in achieving India's urban sustainability and realizing the goal of sustainable development in India. A national policy commitment, as Professor Deshingkar mentioned in his lecture, in the form of specific programs for the migrants is indeed needed. And it is important to enable them to claim access to the city services as a matter of entitlement, as a matter of right. So thank you once again. On behalf of Team IMPRI, again, I thank you, Professor Deshingkar, and we hope to have your guidance in near future as well.
Ma'am, if you would like to have the last word, yes. Ma'am, just 5 seconds. Ma'am, you mentioned about the
wonderful. It's been a wonderful session, and the interactions have been really, really deep and good. I've learned a lot as well. So thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. And I'd be very happy to carry on the conversation after this. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much from all of us, and for really extending the time and enlightening all of us. Ma'am, have a nice day. On the last note, I really want to taste the Deccan Tiffin food sometime soon. Yes. Thank you.
Yes, we must do that.
We look forward. Thank you everyone for joining in and making this deliberation so enriching. And we all learned a lot. And have a nice evening and have a nice day, Professor Deshingkar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Kumar.